You have 72 hours to pack your things and get out, my son said, sliding the eviction notice across the oak table my father had built with his own hands. 6 hours. That's how long my wife Martha had been in the ground before Cody decided to sell our century-old ranch to developers and throw me out of the only home I'd ever known. I stared at this stranger wearing my son's face. Designer suit, cold eyes, expensive briefcase full of legal documents that would turn 4 generations of sterling blood and sweat into golf courses and ski chalets. This land is an underperforming asset, he said, like he was discussing stock options instead of destroying our family legacy. I was 74 years old, betrayed by my own flesh and blood, with nowhere to go and no way to fight back. Or so he thought. What Cody didn't know was that his mother had seen this coming years ago, and the papers he was so proudly waving around were just the first move in a game he didn't even realize he was playing. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The silence was the heaviest thing in the house. Heavier than the grief that sat like a stone in my chest, heavier than the 60 years of memories that pressed down from the rafters. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pines, a mournful sound that had been the soundtrack to my entire life. But in here in the great room my grandfather had built with his own hands, there was nothing. Just the profound emptiness left behind by a world of laughter. I ran a calloused thumb over the arm of Martha's favorite chair. The floral fabric was worn smooth, a testament to decades of her sitting there mending clothes or reading books, while the scent of her baking drifted from the kitchen. I could almost smell it now, cinnamon and apple a ghost on the air. My gaze drifted past the stone fireplace over the mantelpiece, lined with faded photographs of 4 generations of Sterlings, all with the same stubborn chin and clear eyes, all of them staring out at the same view I was, the mountains. They stood like silent eternal witnesses, against the vast bruised sky of late autumn, their peaks already dusted with the promise of a hard winter. This land wasn't just owned by us. It was part of us. Its dirt was under our fingernails, its seasons etched into the lines on our faces. The floorboards creaked behind me, a sound too sharp, too impatient for this quiet house. I didn't need to turn around. I knew the sound of those shoes, expensive Italian leather that had never known a day of mud or honest work. My son, Cody. He stopped a few feet away, the air crackling with a tension that had nothing to do with mourning. I watched his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that looked more at home in a corporate boardroom than a Montana ranch house. His hair was perfectly styled, and his face was a mask of strained formality. "Dad," he began, his voice devoid of the warmth it once held. "We need to talk about the estate." I finally turned my old bones, protesting. I looked at my son, this stranger who wore his face. He was holding a sleek leather briefcase, not a comforting hand. "The estate," I said, my voice rough. "Your mother's been in the ground for 6 hours, Cody. What is there to talk about?" "Practicalities," he said, avoiding my eyes, as he placed the briefcase on the solid oak table my father had made. "Market realities. We can't let sentimentality cloud our judgment." He clicked the latches open and pulled out a sheaf of papers, the crisp sound and offense in the solemn quiet. "Mom signed these last year. To simplify the inheritance. It gives me operational control of Sterling Ranch, LLC. I stared at the documents, then back at his face. "Operational control. That's right," he said, finally meeting my gaze. His eyes were cold, like chips of winter ice. He pushed another paper across the table. It was thicker with an official seal. "And my first operational decision is to accept a standing offer from the Westview Development Group." My blood ran cold. Westview, the vultures who wanted to turn these valleys into golf courses and ski chalets. "You can't," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. This land is an underperforming asset," he cut in, his voice sharp. "And this house, well, it's part of the deal." He tapped the second document. "This is a formal eviction notice, Dad. The developers need the property cleared. You have 72 hours. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. 72 hours. To leave the only home I had ever known. The home my great-grandfather had bled for, my father had tamed, and I had preserved. I looked at my son, at the cool ambition in his eyes, and the full weight of his betrayal crashed down on me. "Your great-grandfather didn't buy this land," I said, my voice dangerously low. "He bled for it. Your father tamed it. I preserved it. I took a step forward. And you look at a century of sacrifice and just see dollar signs per square foot." From the corner of my eye, I saw movement at the kitchen door. Gus Moreno, my foreman, stood there, his weathered face a picture of disbelief and horror. He had heard everything. I didn't wait for Cody's reply. There was nothing more to say. I turned, walked out the door I had walked through 1,000 times, and didn't look back. As my old pickup truck rumbled down the long dirt road, a pair of headlights cut through the twilight, blocking my path. It was a familiar vehicle. Silas Croft, our family lawyer for 40 years. He stepped out, his face grim in the fading light. "Jed, hold on," he said, his voice urgent. "Martha, she saw this coming. I killed the engine. The only sounds were the wind sighing through the dry grass and the tired ticking of my old truck's cooling metal." Silas didn't say another word out on that road. He just gave me a short, sharp nod toward town. "Follow me, Jed." And I did. There was nothing left to do but follow. His office was just as I remembered it from the handful of times Martha had dragged me there over the years. It smelled of old paper leather and dust. A place of history and secrets tucked away on a quiet side street in Bozeman. He closed the door behind us, shutting out the world, and gestured to one of the worn leather chairs facing his massive oak desk. I sank into it, feeling every one of my 74 years. Silas sat down, folded his hands on the desk, and looked me straight in the eye. "First things first, Jed. The papers Cody showed you are legal. Martha did sign." The small flicker of hope I hadn't even realized I was holding on to died. "Then that's it," I said, my voice flat. "No," Silas said firmly. "That's not it. That's just the part of the plan she needed Cody to believe." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a much thicker document bound in dark blue. "This is the Sterling Family Trust. The real power. The papers Cody has are just the bait in the trap." I leaned forward, my weariness replaced by a sharp, focused confusion. "What are you talking about, Silas? Martha was no fool, Jed. She loved that boy more than life itself, but she wasn't blind to his ambition. She saw the way he looked at the land, not as a legacy, but as a commodity." He slid the blue folder across the desk. "She established a trust years ago. It gives Cody operational control, yes. It lets him make the day-to-day decision. It even lets him feel like the king of the castle." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "But it's all conditional. It's bound by something we called the legacy clause." "The legacy clause," I repeated the words, feeling foreign on my tongue. "It's an ironclad provision," Silas explained. "It states that if the operational manager, Cody, takes any action that fundamentally harms the long-term viability or heritage of the Sterling Ranch, a board of overseers has the right to step in and remove him. Immediately." My mind raced, trying to grasp the shape of it. A ghost of a plan, a failsafe. My Martha, always 3 steps ahead of everyone. "And who is on this board?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Silas gave me a sad smile. "It consists of 3 people. The longtime foreman of the ranch, Gus Moreno. The trusted legal counsel of the family, which is me." He leaned forward. "And its chairman is you, Jedediah." The air left my lungs. Me. She had left the power, the final say, in my hands all along. I hadn't been abandoned. I had been armed. She put you in the position of a silent guardian. Silas continued softly. "She knew Cody wouldn't listen to reason. He had to learn through consequences. He has to be allowed to make his own mistakes, to walk right up to the edge of the cliff she knew he was heading for." He reached into the drawer one last time and pulled out a simple sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Martha's familiar elegant script. "She left this for you. Her instructions were clear. I was only to give it to you after Cody made his move." I took the letter. It was thin, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone in my hands. This wasn't a game. It was a painful last-ditch effort by a mother to save her son's soul. It was a burden she had passed to me. I looked up from the letter and met Silas's steady gaze. The grief in my chest was still there, a cold, hard knot, but now something else was growing around it. Not hope, not yet. It was a cold resolve, as unyielding as the mountains outside my window. This was no longer about my pain. It was about my promise to her. "All right, Silas," I said, my voice quiet but firm as I tucked the letter into my jacket pocket. "For Martha, I'll play my part. I didn't drive far. There was a small, clean motel on the edge of town, the kind with a flickering neon sign that offered tired travelers a place of anonymous rest. The room was simple. A bed, a table, a lamp that cast a weak yellow circle of light. It was 1,000,000 miles away from the warmth of the home I had been cast out of, and for now that felt right. I needed a place without memories to face the ones I held in my hand. The envelope felt impossibly fragile. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed and ran my thumb over my name written in her hand. For a long moment I couldn't bring myself to open it. To break the last seal felt like a final goodbye I wasn't ready for. But I had made a promise. With a deep breath that seemed to pull all the cold, sterile air of the room into my lungs, I tore it open. The letter was a single page filled with her familiar looping script. "My dearest Jed," it began. "If you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and our son has chosen the path of greed over the path of love. First, know this: I am so sorry. I am sorry for the pain you are feeling, a pain I prayed you would never have to endure." A familiar ache bloomed in my chest. Her voice was so clear in my head I almost looked up, expecting to see her sitting in the chair across from me. I had to stop and close my eyes, steadying myself against the fresh wave of grief. I forced myself to read on. "You know I love our Cody with every fiber of my being. But a mother's love is not blind. For years I have watched the hunger in his eyes, not for success, but for the appearance of it. He sees our legacy not as a living, breathing thing to be nurtured, but as a mountain of money to be spent. He has a good heart buried deep inside him, Jed, but it's being choked by impatience and pride." She had seen it. Of course she had. I remembered the evenings she'd watch Cody on the phone with his city friends, a quiet, worried frown on her face that I had too often dismissed. I had wanted to believe our son was simply ambitious. Martha had seen the truth. "That is why I have done this terrible, necessary thing. It is not to punish him. You must believe that. It is to save him. A man who has never known hardship cannot know the value of strength. A man who has been given everything cannot understand the pride of earning something. I am giving him the chance to lose it all, Jed, so that he might gain himself." The sheer terrible brilliance of her love hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a legal strategy. It was a mother's desperate surgery on her son's soul, cutting away the sickness so the good man beneath could finally breathe. She was willing to let him hate her, to let him break our hearts, all for the chance to make him whole. The letter continued with details of the plan, confirming what Silas had told me. It instructed me to be a shadow, to watch and wait, to let him fall. "He will fall, my love, and it will be awful to watch. But you must be strong. You must let him hit the bottom. Only when he is there, with nothing left but the dirt and his own 2 hands, will he finally look up and see what truly matters. Trust the man we raised. Trust the heart we gave him. It is still in there." The letter ended simply. "Be my strength in this last hardest task. I love you always, Martha." I folded the page, my hands no longer trembling. The grief was still there, a permanent part of my landscape now. But the confusion, the feeling of being a victim was gone. Martha hadn't left me a burden. She had left me a map, a final mission. My role was not to fight my son, but to shepherd him through the brutal wilderness his mother had so lovingly created for him. I would be her strength. I would be her eyes. I would watch, and I would wait. The first few days passed in a strange gray haze. I established a routine. It was the only way I knew how to keep from drowning in the silence. I'd wake before dawn, the habit of a lifetime too stubborn to break. I'd drive into town and sit in the corner booth of the tip-top diner, nursing a cup of black coffee that was never quite hot enough. The waitresses knew who I was, of course. They'd give me sad, knowing smiles and keep my cup full without asking. I'd watch the other ranchers and townsfolk come in, their talk of cattle prices and the coming snow feeling like a broadcast from another world. I was among my people, yet I had never felt more like a ghost. After breakfast, I'd drive. I'd head up into the hills, always careful to stay miles away from my own land, and just watch the sky. I was waiting. It was the hardest work I'd ever done. The call came on the 4th day. I was back in my motel room, staring out the window at the parking lot, when my cheap flip phone buzzed against the nightstand. The screen read Gus. I answered before the second ring. Jed, his voice was low, rough around the edges like always. "Gus," I said, my own voice steady. "What's the news?" There was a pause, and I could hear the familiar wind whistling in the background on his end. He was outside. "They're here, boss." I didn't have to ask who they were. My hand tightened around the small phone. "Tell me." 3 shiny black cars rolled up about an hour ago, he said, the disgust in his voice plain. "Cody's strutting around with them like a prize rooster. City folk, shiny shoes and suits that cost more than my truck. They got blueprints and survey equipment." I closed my eyes. It was happening. "Where are they?" "Up on the North Ridge right now," Gus said. "The North Ridge, where I'd taken Martha for picnics. Where my father taught me the names of the constellations." A cold anger, clean and sharp, cut through my grief. "What are they saying?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "A lot of nonsense words," Gus grumbled. "Talking about view sheds and lot potential." One of them pointed down at Miller's Creek and called it a charming water feature. he spat. I could hear it clearly over the phone. They're not looking at a home, Jed. They're looking at a catalog. I stood up and began to pace the small room, the worn carpet doing nothing to soften my heavy steps. I felt like a caged animal listening to the hunters stalking through my territory. Martha's words echoed in my head. Let him fall. It will be awful to watch. She hadn't been wrong. This was agony. What's Cody doing? I asked. Laughing, Gus said, and that one word hit me harder than any of the others. He's laughing and pointing, selling them the sunset like he painted it himself. He's not one of us anymore, Jed. I knew he was right. My son had become a stranger, a salesman of his own birthright. All right, Gus, I said, my jaw tight. You've done good. Keep your head down. Just keep me informed. You know I will, he said, and the line went dead. I stood in the middle of that cheap motel room for a long time, the dead phone still pressed to my ear. The plan had been set in motion. Cody had fired the first shot in a war against his own history, and all I could do was stand here miles away and listen to the echoes of the destruction to come. Another week bled into the next. The waiting began to feel like a physical weight, a constant pressure behind my ribs. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would seize for a moment. I knew the next call would be the one that truly tested Martha's plan and my own strength. It came on a Tuesday morning just as I was finishing my coffee at the diner. He's done it! Jed Gus's voice was stripped of its usual gruffness. It was hollow. I pushed my half-eaten breakfast away, my appetite vanishing instantly. Done what, Gus? The men, he said, and I heard him take a shaky breath. He fired them, half the crew. Just gone. I had been expecting it. I had been steeling myself for it. But hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. Who Miguel Gus started, and each name was a blow. 30 years he's been with us, Jed, since he was a boy. Tom, whose father worked for your father. Young Sam. All of them. He listed off 8 names in total. These weren't just employees. They were neighbors. They were men I had worked alongside, men whose children had grown up with Cody. They were family in all the ways that mattered. How did he do it? I asked, my voice a low growl. Called them into the main house this morning, Gus explained. One by one. Didn't even have the decency to face them as a group. Gave them 2 weeks' pay and a sheet of paper. Said their positions were redundant in his workforce restructuring. The corporate venom in those words made me sick. This wasn't the language of our people. It was the language of asset strippers and corporate raiders. The language of men who saw other human beings as numbers on a spreadsheet. What was the reason I pressed, needing to hear the lie from my son's mouth, even secondhand? The real reason he told them the ranch was moving in a new direction, and their skills were no longer a match for the company's future needs. Gus said, the contempt in his voice thick enough to taste. He's clearing the way, Jed. Getting rid of anyone loyal to the old ways. Loyal to you. A cold, heavy silence settled between us. I could picture the scene perfectly. Cody standing in the great room where he took his first steps, looking down his nose at men who had taught him how to ride a horse and dismissing their entire lives with a few careless, cruel words. And what about you, Gus? I finally asked, a new fear gripping me. He needs me for now, Gus said. Someone's got to run the day-to-day until his precious developers take over. But my time's coming. I can see it in his eyes. He paused. What do we do, Jed? It was the question I had been dreading. The men would be looking to me. The whole valley would. And I had to do nothing. I had to honor Martha's plan. You do your job, Gus, I said, the words tasting like ash. You keep the rest of the crew together. You hold the line. And you, I wait, I said, and hung up the phone. I sat there in the diner for a long time, the coffee gone cold. A Sterling had never broken his word to a man who worked for him. It was a code, an honor passed down from my great-grandfather. Today, my son had not just fired 8 good men. He had taken a hammer to the very foundation of our name. He was cutting the roots one by one, thinking it would make the tree easier to fell. He didn't understand. He was killing it from the inside out. The news of the firings had spread through the valley like a grass fire. When I went to the diner now, the talk would stop. Men I'd known my whole life would just nod at me, their eyes full of questions they didn't dare ask. Why are you letting him do this, Jed? I could hear it in their silence. It took every ounce of my will not to tell them to defend my inaction. Instead, I just drank my coffee and endured their judgment. The next call from Gus came late at night, long after the sun had dipped behind the mountains. This time his voice wasn't just angry or sad. It was raw with alarm. Jed, you're not going to believe this. Try me, Gus, I said, sitting up on the edge of the motel bed. It's the water, he said, the words coming out in a rush. He's selling the water rights. All of them. From Miller's Creek. For a moment I couldn't process it. It was unthinkable. What are you talking about? Who would he sell them to? A corporation? Clear Mountain Bottling or some such nonsense, Gus spat. They were here today. Men in suits, just like the others, but these ones were different. Geologists. Hydrologists. They weren't looking at land, Jed. They were looking through it. Straight down to the aquifer. I stood up, a hot rage building in my gut so fast it made me dizzy. He can't... The agreement? He doesn't care about the agreement. Gus's voice cracked with frustration. I told him, I said, Mr. Sterling, your great-grandfather gave his word. The ranches downstream depend on that water. It's a gentleman's agreement. You know what he told me, Jed? What I asked, my voice tight. He said, a gentleman's agreement isn't legally binding, Gus. And I'm a businessman, not a gentleman. The arrogance, the sheer disrespect knocked the wind out of me. For 100 years, the Sterlings had been stewards of that water. We shared it. We protected it. It was the lifeblood of this entire valley. Selling it wasn't just a business deal. It was a betrayal of every neighbor, every friend, every family that called this place home. It was poisoning the well for generations to come, all for a quick payout. This is it, Jed Gus pleaded. This is the line. You've got to step in. You've got to stop him. The legacy clause. This has to be it, right? Every instinct I had screamed at me to agree. To drive to that ranch, walk into my own house, and throw my son out myself. To invoke the clause and end this madness. My hand was shaking, but then I heard Martha's voice as clear as if she were in the room from the pages of her letter. Let him hit the bottom. Only then will he look up. This was the edge of the cliff she'd talked about. But he hadn't jumped yet. For the plan to work, the choice had to be his. The consequences had to be absolute. No, I said, and the word felt like swallowing glass. Jed, what Gus's disbelief was a fresh wound. Not yet, I clarified, my voice strained. For this to stick, he has to sign the papers. The deal has to be done. I need proof, Gus. Undeniable proof of the damage it will cause. Get me a copy of the contract. Talk to the neighbors downstream. Document everything. But do not interfere. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. I knew what he was thinking. That I was a coward. That I had abandoned everything my family stood for. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. All right, Jed. Whatever you say. He hung up. I sank back onto the bed, the weight of his disappointment crushing me. My son was about to break faith with an entire community. My best friend now thought I was a spineless old fool, and I had to sit here in this lonely room and let it all happen. This, I realized, was what Martha had meant. This was the true cost of saving my son's soul. Something was shifting in the air. I could feel it when I went into town for supplies. The whispers that used to stop when I entered a room now continued, just pitched a little lower. I saw neighbors huddled in front of the post office, heads bent together over a clipboard. I saw a flyer for an emergency town hall meeting tacked to the bulletin board at the feed store. The headline was simple and sharp: Our water, our future. I felt a strange and painful pride. These were my people, stubborn, independent, and fiercely protective of their home. For generations, the Sterlings had been leaders in that community, the first to stand up against outside threats. Now, the community was standing up against a Sterling. I was a ghost watching my own legacy rise up to fight my own son. The call this time wasn't from Gus. It was from Silas. His tone wasn't emotional, it was professional. It was the sound of trouble becoming official. Jed, I thought you should know, he began without preamble. The town hall meeting last night was standing room only. Old Man Hemlock from the downstream ranch spoke for nearly an hour, presented a petition with over 400 signatures. 400, I repeated, closing my eyes. That was nearly every family in the valley. What are they petitioning for? For the county to review the environmental impact of the water deal, Silas said. It's a delaying tactic mostly, but a smart one. And the Bozeman Chronicle sent a reporter. There's a story on the front page this morning. I could picture it. A picture of Hemlock's weathered face, quotes from angry ranchers. Cody's carefully constructed corporate world was about to collide with the hard reality of a small town's fury. That's not all, Silas continued. I got a call this morning, an exploratory one, from a lawyer representing Westview Development. My heart hammered against my ribs. The investors, they're getting nervous, Jed, he said. The article spooked them. They invest in luxury resorts, not community battles. Bad press is the one thing they can't afford. Their lawyer was asking delicate questions. about potential legal challenges about the stability of Cody's position. So there it was. The first crack in the foundation. It wasn't my doing. It wasn't Martha's plan, not directly. It was the valley itself. It was the decency and the fighting spirit of the people we had lived alongside our entire lives. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him the Sterling family has a long history in this valley and that our legal affairs are in order, Silas replied, his voice a careful, lawyerly neutral. I gave him nothing, but I suspect I gave him everything he needed to hear. We spoke for a few more minutes, but my mind was elsewhere. After I hung up, I walked to the window of my small motel room. I looked out towards the distant, hazy outline of the mountains that marked my land. My home. Cody thought he was fighting against an old man's sentimentality. He was wrong. He was fighting against the ghost of his own mother's kindness, against the memory of his grandfather's handshake. He was fighting against every good and decent thing our family name had ever stood for. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized he might actually lose. I didn't have to wait long. The world Cody had tried to build was a house of cards, and the angry breath of the valley was all it took to make it tremble. The final gust of wind came a week later again through a call from Silas. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. The voice of a man stating a fact, not an opinion. It's done, Jed. Westview Development has officially withdrawn their offer. I sat down on the hard motel chair, the phone pressed tight against my ear. Are you sure? I have a copy of the letter they sent to Cody's lawyer, Silas confirmed. They cited insurmountable community opposition and unforeseen reputational risks. That's corporate speak for, we don't want to get into a mud wrestling match with a bunch of angry ranchers in Montana. I should have felt a sense of victory. I should have felt relief. But all I felt was a cold, heavy dread. I knew what this meant. I knew the kind of financial risks Cody took, the way he always bet everything on the next big score. What about the loan? I asked, my voice quiet. There was a brief rustle of papers on Silas's end. That's the real problem. Cody took out a $5 million bridge loan to begin the initial clearing and site prep. He used the ranch itself as collateral. $5 million. The number was obscene. He had gambled our entire legacy on a handshake from men in shiny shoes. The loan was contingent on Westview's funding coming through within 60 days, Silas continued. That deadline is next Friday. Without their investment, he's in default. The bank will seize the asset. They'll own the Sterling Ranch, Jed, lock, stock, and barrel. The trap had sprung, not the one Martha had set, but the one Cody had built for himself piece by arrogant piece. He had wanted to sell our history for a fortune, and now he was about to lose it for nothing. He was about to become the Sterling who lost the land. The shame of that would follow him to his grave. So he has no way out, I stated. It wasn't a question. None that I can see, Silas said. He has no other investors, no other source of income. He leveraged everything on this one deal. After we hung up, I didn't move for a long time. There was no satisfaction in this. There was no joy in being right. All I could feel was the deep, aching sorrow of a father. My son, my foolish, proud son, was about to face a reckoning far harsher than I could ever have devised. Martha had wanted him to hit the bottom. She knew it was the only way, but I wondered if even she had anticipated how hard and how fast the fall would be. He was alone up there now in that big, empty house with the ghosts of his own failures closing in around him. The phone on my nightstand remained silent, but I knew it would ring. It was only a matter of time. The call came 3 days before the bank's deadline. It came just after midnight. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, a harsh, angry sound in the dark. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew. I let it ring 3 times before picking up my hand steady. Hello, I said into the silence. There was a long pause on the other end, filled with the sound of a ragged breath being drawn. Then a voice I almost didn't recognize. It was thin, hollowed out, a ghost of my son's voice. Dad, I'm here, Cody, I said. Another silence. I could hear him trying to form words, the sounds getting caught in his throat. The arrogance was gone. The sharp, dismissive edge he'd had for years had been sanded down to nothing. All that was left was the raw sound of defeat. They're gone, Dad, he finally whispered. The investors. They pulled out, all of them. I didn't say, I know. I didn't say anything. I just listened. This was his confession to make, not my victory to claim. The bank. His voice cracked. The bank is taking it all. On Friday. The land, the house, everything. It's all gone. He choked on a sob, a raw, ugly sound that tore right through me. I lost it, Dad. I lost everything. For 40 years I had been a father. I had fixed scraped knees, chased away nightmares, and offered advice he rarely took. My every instinct was screaming at me to comfort him, to tell him it would be all right, to promise I would fix it. But Martha's words held me back. He has to hit the bottom. So I stayed silent, giving him the space to feel the full weight of his own words. I was so stupid, he sobbed, the words tumbling out now. I was so arrogant. I thought I knew better than everyone. Better than you, better than Mom. He mentioned her name, and his voice broke completely. God, what would she think of me? She would love you, I thought. This is all because she loves you. What do you want me to do, Cody? I asked, my voice quiet even. He seemed taken aback by the question, as if he hadn't thought that far ahead. There was a long pause. I could hear his shallow breathing on the other end of the line. He was a drowning man who had just realized he didn't know how to ask for a lifeline. I don't know, he stammered. I don't have anyone else. All those friends, those partners, they vanished the second the money did. He took another shuddering breath. I'm alone here. I waited. This had to be his choice. Finally, he whispered it, the question that cost his pride everything. Can you come home, Dad, please? I don't know what to do. Can you just come home? The word home hung in the air between us. It wasn't his house anymore. It wasn't the bank's house yet. It was just home. An admission. A plea. The cold resolve in my heart didn't melt, but it made room for the aching love of a father. I'll be there in the morning, son, I said. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness for a long time. The first part of Martha's plan was over. The fall was complete. Now came the hard part. Now I had to go back and see what, if anything, was left to rebuild. Driving up the long dirt road felt like traveling backward in time, but to a corrupted version of my own life. The fences were intact. The fields lay dormant under the morning frost, but something was wrong. The air itself felt different, heavy with neglect. The usual morning sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the hum of Gus's tractor, were absent. There was only a profound, unsettling silence. I parked the truck where I always had, beside the old cottonwood tree. I got out and just stood there for a moment, looking at my home. It looked wounded. The porch swing Martha and I had spent so many summer evenings on was askew. The flower beds she had tended with such care were choked with weeds. The front door was slightly ajar, like a mouth agape in shock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cold that greeted me had nothing to do with the morning air. It was a dead, stale cold. The house smelled of whiskey and despair. The great room, once a place of warmth and order, was a disaster. Empty glasses and plates were scattered on the tables. Cushions were thrown on the floor, and spread across the great oak table like a funeral shroud was a blizzard of paper. Letters, envelopes with angry red stamps, legal notices, and in the middle of it all, slumped in my father's armchair, was Cody. He looked like a stranger. He was still wearing yesterday's clothes, a wrinkled designer shirt that was now stained and rumpled. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and his eyes, when he finally lifted them to look at me, were bloodshot and hollow. He looked older, smaller, broken. Dad, he said, his voice a dry rasp. I didn't say anything. I walked over to the table and picked up one of the letters. It was from the bank. The words were stark, merciless. Notice of intent to foreclose. I dropped it back onto the pile. It was all real. The ruin was complete. I tried, he whispered, his gaze dropping to the floor. I called other banks, other investors. No one will touch me. The word is out. He gestured vaguely at the pile of papers. They all want their money. He looked so utterly defeated, so completely stripped of the pride and arrogance that had been his armor for years. A part of me, the father in me, wanted to rush over and pull him into my arms. But a wiser, harder part, the part that now carried Martha's will, knew that this moment was too important. He had to sit in this wreckage. He had to breathe its dust. I walked past him and went to the window, looking out at the mountains. They were the same as always, unchanging, unimpressed. I messed up, he said from behind me, his voice thick with a shame so deep it was almost a physical presence in the room. I know that. I finally turned to face him. I looked at my broken son, sitting amidst the ruins of his own making. Yes, you did, son, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the mountains themselves. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Cody stared at me, his eyes wide and blank. My question hung in the cold air between us, a question he had no answer for. Do about it, he finally stammered. What can I do? It's over, Dad. The bank wants $5 million by Friday. Do you have $5 million? The old Cody was still in there somewhere. the one who believed every problem could be solved by a check. No, son, I don't, I said, and it wasn't a lie. I didn't have it. It was tied up in the trust governed by Martha's rules. The money is gone. Your money, anyway. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. So that's it. You came back to watch the whole thing burn down. No, I said, taking a step closer. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his self-pity. I came back to offer you a way out. The only way out. A flicker of desperate hope appeared in his eyes. What is it? A different loan? Another investor? No, I said again, shaking my head slowly. No more easy money. No more shortcuts. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to listen. You want to save this land? Then you're going to learn its value. Not in dollars, but in sweat. He just stared at me, uncomprehending. 5 a.m. Tomorrow morning I laid it out, each word a stone being placed on a foundation. You report to Gus. He'll be your boss now. You'll do exactly as he says. You'll mend the fences you let fall apart. You'll muck out the stalls. You'll work like the men you fired. The disbelief on his face was absolute. It was as if I had suggested he fly to the moon. Work, he whispered. As a ranch hand. Are you insane? The bank isn't going to wait while I play cowboy dad. They need money. The bank can wait, I said, a hard edge in my voice now. I'll talk to them. I'll buy us some time. But that time has a price, and you're going to pay it. In blisters and sore muscles. This is humiliating, he said, shaking his head, the last vestiges of his pride fighting back. It's pointless. Is it? I challenged him, my voice rising for the first time. You lost this ranch because you thought you were above the work it requires. You disrespected the land, the animals, and the people who gave their lives to it. The only way you can earn the right to call yourself a Sterling again is to get your hands dirty with the same soil your ancestors bled for. I stood over him, not as a tyrant, but as a force of nature he could no longer ignore. He looked from my face to my calloused hands, and then down at his own soft, clean ones. He looked at the foreclosure notices, at the empty bottles, at the complete and utter ruin of his life. He had nowhere else to turn. The fight finally drained out of him, leaving behind a hollowed-out man. He dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. A long, shuddering sigh escaped him. It was the sound of absolute surrender. When he finally looked up, the hollows of his eyes were wet. He gave a single broken nod. 5 a.m., he whispered. Long before the sun thought about cresting the mountains, the lights in the barn flickered on. I stood at the kitchen window, a mug of hot coffee warming my hands, and watched. Gus was already out there, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this every morning for 50 years. A few minutes before 5, the back door of the main house opened. Cody emerged, a silhouette against the lighted doorway. He was wearing a brand new pair of work boots and a clean canvas jacket that looked stiff and unnatural on him. He looked like an actor playing the part of a ranch hand, not the real thing. He hesitated for a moment in the biting cold, then trudged towards the barn, his steps uncertain in the dark. I stayed where I was. This was Gus's show now. My presence would only complicate things. Through the barn's wide-open doors, I could see the scene unfold under the harsh electric lights. Gus didn't greet him. He just pointed to a shovel. Stalls need mucking was all I imagined him saying. For the next hour, I watched my son, who had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, now knee-deep in hay and manure, wielding a shovel with the awkward clumsiness of a boy. His movements were all wrong, too much back, not enough legs. Every motion was an inefficient struggle. Gus never offered to help. He just watched his arms cross, his expression as hard and unreadable as granite. After the stalls, it was the fences. Gus loaded a roll of barbed wire and a post driver into the back of his truck. Cody had to lift the second roll. I saw him stagger under the weight, his face straining in the pale morning light. They drove out to the west pasture, where a section of fence had been down for weeks. I got in my own truck and drove a long roundabout way, parking on a rise half a mile away where I could watch through my old binoculars. It was painful to see. Cody fumbled with the tools. He hit his own thumb with the hammer. He got tangled in the wire, tearing his new jacket. Gus offered no sympathy, just short, clipped instructions. Tension's wrong. Do it again. That post's not deep enough. Pull it out. Again. Stop thinking about it so much. Just work. By lunchtime, Cody was a mess. He was covered in mud, his hands were raw, and his face was a mask of exhaustion and frustration. He leaned against a fence post, breathing heavily, while Gus sat on the tailgate of the truck, eating a sandwich with slow, deliberate bites. Cody didn't eat. He just stared at his own blistered hands as if they belonged to someone else. I lowered the binoculars, a knot in my stomach. Martha's voice echoed in my mind. It will be awful to watch. She was right. Every instinct I had wanted me to drive down there to tell Gus to ease up, to give the boy a break. But I knew this was the point. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about stripping him down to the foundation. All his life he had used his mind and his money to avoid this kind of struggle. Now he had nothing else. He had to learn the language of the land, and it was a language spoken only through sweat and pain. The first lesson was underway, and it was a brutal one. The next 3 weeks were a slow grind for both of us. For Cody, it was the physical toll. Every morning he'd limp out of the house, his body aching in places he never knew he had. For me, it was the emotional one, watching from a distance, trusting a plan that felt crueler with each passing day. I didn't speak to him much. I'd moved back into the main house, sleeping in the guest room, a constant reminder of my changed status. We'd share silent breakfasts, the only sounds, the clinking of forks, and the ticking of the grandfather clock. He was too tired and too proud to talk, and I was giving him the space to fight his own demons. But I was watching, and I was listening to Gus's short nightly reports. He's still clumsy, Gus would say, but he's not quitting, I'll give him that. A week later, the report changed slightly. He stopped complaining. Gus noted a hint of surprise in his voice. Just puts his head down and does the work now. Still does it wrong half the time, but he's not whining about it. That was the first real sign. The angry pride was being worn down, replaced by a quiet, exhausted resignation. He was learning that the land didn't care about his feelings. The fences needed mending whether he was in the mood or not. The biggest change came during their lunch breaks. The few remaining ranch hands men Cody had deemed essential enough not to fire would sit on the sunny side of the barn eating their sandwiches. At first, Cody had kept his distance, eating alone, an outcast in his own home. But the cold and the solitude eventually drove him to the edge of their circle. He never spoke. He just sat and listened. And the men, after a few days of awkward silence, started talking again. They didn't talk to him, but around him. They talked about the blizzard of 2096 when my father had saved a whole herd. They talked about the time a young Gus had fallen from his horse and my Martha had set his arm right there in the field. They talked about droughts and good years, about difficult births and prize bulls. They were telling the history of the Sterling Ranch, not from a ledger book, but from their own memories. They were speaking the language of the land, a language of shared hardship and loyalty. One night, Gus's report was different. "Something strange happened today, Jed." "What's that?" I asked. "We were fixing the old well pump. It's a tricky job. Cody was just handing me tools. One of the boys, Dave, was telling that old story about your grandfather and the rogue bear. Cody," he was listening. I mean really listening. Gus paused. When Dave finished, Cody said one thing. He just said, "I've never heard that story before." That was it. But the way he said it, it was quiet, curious. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the wall of arrogance he had built around himself. For the first time, he wasn't trying to impose his own story on the ranch. He was starting to listen to the stories the ranch had to tell him. That night, for the first time in a month, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't just cold resolve. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. It was hope. He wasn't just learning how to work. He was learning how to be quiet. He was learning the weight of the history he had so carelessly tried to throw away. The sky had been a liar all morning, a thin, deceptive blue. But by mid-afternoon, a greasy gray film had spread from the north, and the air grew still and heavy. Gus stopped his work, sniffing the wind like an old hound. "Trouble's coming," he said, his eyes narrowed on the ridgeline. And fast. Just then, the wind shifted, hitting us with a blast of Arctic cold that went right through our coats. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. It wasn't a whisper of winter anymore. It was a scream. "The herd," I said, my heart suddenly pounding. "The pregnant heifers are still in the high pasture." It was the worst possible scenario. They were the future of our ranch, vulnerable, and miles from the safety of the main barn. We had 3, maybe 4 men. It wasn't enough. We scrambled back to the barn, the first stinging flakes of snow already driving into our faces. As Gus yelled instructions to the other hands, I turned to Cody. He was staring out at the worsening storm, his face pale. For a heartbeat, I saw the old Cody flicker in his eyes, the city boy looking for an exit, overwhelmed by a problem he couldn't solve with money. Then it was gone. He turned to me, his jaw set. He wasn't the clumsy boy who'd hit his own thumb a month ago. His hands were calloused now, his face leaner, harder. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice clear and steady over the rising howl of the wind. "Stay with Gus and me," I ordered. "We're taking the horses. The trucks won't make it." The next few hours were a blur of blinding snow and brutal effort. The storm hit with a fury I hadn't seen in years, a full-blown blizzard that turned the world into a swirling vortex of white. It was a battle for every single step. The wind tore at us, trying to rip us from our saddles, and the snow was so thick I could barely see Gus riding 10 feet in front of me. We found the herd huddled together, miserable and spooked. Getting them moving was a nightmare. One calf born just days before collapsed in the snow, refusing to move. "Leave it," Gus yelled, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "We'll lose the whole herd for one." It was the hard calculus of ranching, a truth I knew well. But Cody, who was nearest to the calf, shook his head. He dismounted, sinking to his waist in a snowdrift. I watched, my heart in my throat, as my son fought his way to the freezing animal. He lifted it, staggering under the weight, and began the slow, tortuous walk back towards the barn, carrying the calf in his arms, his head bowed against the punishing wind. He didn't complain. He didn't falter. He just kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. The rest of us, inspired by his stubbornness, redoubled our efforts and finally got the herd moving. We stumbled back into the main barn hours later, just as the last of the light died. We were frozen, exhausted, but we hadn't lost a single one. Cody gently placed the calf in a warm stall before collapsing against the wall, his chest heaving. Gus walked over to him. He didn't praise him. He didn't slap him on the back. He just looked at Cody, who was covered in snow and filth, and gave him a single slow nod. A nod of respect. In our world, that was worth more than a medal. As I watched them, I finally understood the depth of Martha's plan. She hadn't just wanted him to learn the value of work. She wanted him to learn the value of a life that wasn't his own. Tonight he had. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and silent under a blanket of white. It also left behind a subtle shift in the air of the ranch. The men looked at Cody differently now. He was still the boss's son, but he was also one of them. He had earned his place. We were in the barn, repairing a gate damaged by the wind, when the shiny black SUV rolled up the drive. It was the same kind of vehicle the first developers had used, and it set my teeth on edge. A man in a tailored overcoat and city shoes stepped out, picking his way carefully through the slush. "Cody Sterling?" he asked, his eyes sweeping over the barn with a dismissive air. He clearly wasn't impressed. Cody wiped his greasy hands on a rag and stepped forward. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore. He was wearing muddy boots, worn jeans, and a jacket that was now torn and stained. "I'm Cody Sterling," he said, his voice even. I leaned against a stall, pretending to be busy, but I watched every move. This was a test I hadn't anticipated. "My name is Marcus Thorne," the man said, offering a business card that Cody ignored. "I represent a smaller private consortium. We heard the Westview deal fell through. We also heard about your financial difficulties with the bank." Cody didn't flinch. "What do you want?" "To make you an offer," Thorne said with a slick smile. "A lifeline. We're prepared to offer you $6 million. In cash. Enough to pay off your loan and walk away with $1 million in your pocket. No development plans, no community battles. We'll handle the bank. You just sign the deed and disappear." The silence in the barn was absolute. It was the perfect temptation, a clean break, a way out of all the mess, all the hard work. A chance to go back to the life he once knew with his pockets full. I held my breath. I had to let him make this choice alone. This was his moment, his soul to claim or to lose. Cody looked at Thorne. Then his gaze drifted past the man, out the barn doors, to the snow-covered fields, to the mountains, standing silent guard. He looked at the gate he was in the middle of fixing with his own 2 hands. I saw something shift in his eyes, a final click of a lock falling into place. He turned back to the developer, and for the first time in his life he sounded exactly like his grandfather. "Let me get this straight," Cody said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You want to give me $1 million to walk away from my home, my family's history, and the future I almost destroyed." Thorne's smile faltered. "It's a very generous offer, Mr. Sterling." "No, it's an insult," Cody said, tossing the rag aside. "This ranch isn't for sale. It's not an asset. It's a legacy." He took a step forward, and for the first time the city man looked intimidated. "Now I've got a gate to fix. You're trespassing on my land. I suggest you leave." Thorne stared for a moment, blinked, then turned on his heel and walked back to his shiny car without another word. Cody watched him drive away, his shoulders set. He then turned, picked up his hammer, and went back to work on the gate as if nothing had happened. He hadn't even looked at me. He didn't need to. He had finally come home. I stayed in the shadows of the barn for a long moment, just watching him work. He wasn't just fixing a gate. He was reclaiming a piece of himself. The sound of his hammer was steady and sure. I walked out into the cold, bright sunlight. He heard my steps in the snow and looked up, his expression unreadable. He probably expected a lecture or maybe even praise. I offered him neither. I saw that I said simply. He stopped hammering and leaned against the gatepost, wiping a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. Yeah, was all he said. A couple of months ago you would have taken that deal in a heartbeat, I stated, watching him closely. You would have thanked him for the chance to run. What changed, Cody? It was the most important question I had ever asked him. I needed to hear it from his own mouth. I needed to know the change was real, rooted deep inside him. He looked down at his hands, turning them over. They were no longer the smooth hands of a city boy. They were red, calloused, and scratched. These changed, he said quietly. At first I hated it. I hated the pain, the cold, the filth. I hated you for making me do it. He looked up, and his eyes were clear without a trace of the old arrogance. But then, I started listening. To Gus. To the other men. They told stories about Grandpa, about you, about Mom. Stories I'd never heard. I realized this place wasn't just a piece of property. It was a collection of lives. 100 years of trying and failing and trying again. He took a breath. Then the blizzard hit. And when I was out there carrying that calf, I wasn't thinking about money or deals. I was just thinking about getting that little thing back to the warmth of the barn. About its life. He finally looked me straight in the eye. I realized its life was worth more than any developer's check. This whole place is the words I had longed to hear. The words Martha had bet everything on. The son I had raised was standing in front of me again. Your mother, I said, my voice thick with emotion. She knew that man was in you all along. She never lost faith. Cody looked confused. What do you mean? There's more to this story, son, I said, putting a hand on his shoulder for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. More than you know. There are reasons things happened the way they did. It's time you learned the truth, the whole truth. His brow furrowed a flicker of the old suspicion in his eyes. What truth? The truth about your mother's will, I said. The truth about the last few months. I squeezed his shoulder gently. Go on back to the house. Get cleaned up. Meet me at Silas Croft's office in an hour. He's expecting us. He stared at me, a dozen questions in his eyes, but he saw the finality in my expression. He gave a slow, uncertain nod. As I watched him trudge back towards the house, I felt the immense weight of the last few months begin to lift. Martha's gamble, her terrible, beautiful plan had worked. Now all that was left was to show our son the full, incredible depth of his mother's love. Cody walked into Silas's office looking like a man heading to his own sentencing. He'd cleaned up, but the uncertainty was written all over his face. He nodded stiffly at Silas, then looked at me, his eyes full of questions. Sit down, Cody, Silas said, his voice gentle but firm. He gestured to the leather chair opposite his desk. I sat in the chair beside it. Silas didn't waste time. He slid the thick blue-bound document across the desk. You've seen the papers that gave you operational control, he began, but you've never seen the document that governs them. This is the Sterling Family Trust. Cody looked at the document, then back at Silas, confused. I don't understand. I'll draw your attention to Article 4. Silas continued, his tone methodical. The Legacy Clause. It specifies that any action taken by the operational manager that harms the long-term heritage of the ranch, such as selling off land to developers or breaking faith with the community over water rights, triggers an immediate review by an oversight board. Cody's face paled. A what? Who is this board? It has 3 members, Silas said. Gus Moreno, myself, and its chairman, your father. The color drained completely from Cody's face. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. You, he whispered, you could have stopped this, all of it, the day I threw you out. You could have stopped me. The accusation in his voice was thick with betrayal. Before I could answer, Silas pushed a final document in front of him. And this is the last part of the plan. Funds set aside by your mother years ago. Not for a buyout, for modernizing the ranch sustainably, for hiring back the men you fired, for rebuilding. Cody stared at the paper, his mind clearly reeling. I don't understand, he stammered, looking back and forth between us. Why would you let this happen? Why put me through all this? That was my cue. I leaned forward, my hands clasped in front of me. It was never about the land, Cody, I said, my voice soft. It was never about the money. It was always about you. I told him everything. I told him about Martha's letter, her fears, her unwavering belief that the good man she knew was still inside him. I told him about her desperate plan to save him from his own worst impulses. She knew you had to lose everything, I said, the words catching in my throat. She knew you had to feel the sting of failure, the weight of real work. She was willing to let you think you'd lost our home, even our love, if it meant you might finally find yourself. The truth finally landed. And it broke him. He didn't just cry. He put his head in his hands and sobbed, a deep, racking sound that came from the very center of his soul. It wasn't the sound of a man who had lost a fortune. It was the sound of a boy who finally understood the sheer, terrifying, beautiful depth of his mother's love. She had seen the monster he was becoming, and she had built a terrible, perfect trap, not to destroy him, but to save him. She knew he choked out between sobs. She knew what I would do. And she did this anyway. Yes, I said, my own eyes blurring. She did. He sat there for a long time, the sound of his grief filling the quiet office. The arrogant businessman was gone. The broken son was gone. All that was left was a man finally baptized in the truth of his family's love. A year can change everything. The autumn that returned to the valley was not the same one that had brought such grief. This one arrived on a crisp, golden wind, carrying the scent of cured hay, and the promise of a peaceful winter. The silence I had returned to was gone, replaced by the familiar, comforting sounds of a working ranch. From the porch, I watched Cody and Gus leaning over the hood of a tractor, looking at a schematic. There was an easy camaraderie between them now, a mutual respect forged in the crucible of a blizzard and the daily grind of hard work. Cody didn't give orders anymore. He asked questions. He listened. The ranch was more alive than it had been in years. Using the funds Martha had set aside, Cody had not just repaired what he'd broken, but had improved upon it. We'd invested in sustainable grazing techniques and restored the banks of Miller's Creek. The water flowed freely, a symbol of our renewed promise to the valley. Most importantly, the men were back. Cody had gone to each one hat in hand and personally apologized. He didn't just offer them their jobs back. He offered them a partnership. We used a portion of the trust to help them form a local co-op, a way for the smaller ranches in the valley to pool their resources and get a fair price for their cattle, something my father had always dreamed of doing. The Sterling Ranch was no longer an island. It was an anchor. Later that evening, after the work was done, Cody joined me on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of orange and deep purple. For a long time we sat in the comfortable silence that only comes when everything that needs to be said has already been said. He had changed. The city softness was gone for good, replaced by a quiet strength. The restlessness in his eyes had settled into a calm, steady gaze. He looked like a man who knew his place in the world. I was talking to Silas today, he said, breaking the silence. He said, the co-op is already making a difference for the Hemlock family. Your grandfather would be proud of that, I said. He always believed we rise together or we fall together. Cody nodded his eyes on the horizon. I used to look at these mountains and see an obstacle, something blocking the view of what was next, he said quietly. Something to be sold or developed. He turned his gaze to me. Now I look at them and I see permanence. I see home. I put my hand on his shoulder. The same shoulder I had gripped in anger, the same one I had wanted to comfort in his despair. Now it was just the shoulder of my son, a good man standing beside me. We had been through the fire, and we had come out the other side, not unscathed but stronger, whole. Martha's plan had been a terrible risk born of a desperate love. But as I sat there with my son beside me and the sounds of a healthy, healing ranch settling into the twilight, I knew she had been right. She hadn't just saved our son. She had saved our legacy, planting it in the one place it could truly grow in his heart. My wife Martha used to say that the toughest winters often lead to the strongest spring growth. It's a lesson that took me a lifetime to truly understand, and one my son had to learn in the harshest of ways. Our family's legacy was never just about the land, the fences, or the cattle. Those are just things. The real legacy, the one that endures, is the strength we find in each other when we think all is lost. It's the wisdom that's earned through failure and the grace that's found in a second chance. Cody didn't lose the ranch. He just took the long, hard road to finally inheriting it. What a journey we've shared today. Stories like Cody's remind us that sometimes we have to be completely broken down before we can be rebuilt into the person we were always meant to be. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.